What if one of the greatest thinkers in history spent his entire life trying to understand truth, only to say at the end that everything he wrote was almost nothing compared to what he experienced? Thomas Aquinas didn't just believe in God. He tried to prove him using logic, reason, and philosophy. But the deeper he went, the more he realized something unsettling. That reason can take you incredibly far, but not all the way. Thomas Aquinas was born in 1225 in a world where truth was not questioned, it was inherited. In medieval Europe, the structure of life was already decided before a person was even born. Kings ruled under divine authority. The church defined morality, and knowledge itself was guarded within religious institutions. To doubt was not just intellectual rebellion, it was spiritual danger. Into this rigid and deeply ordered world came a child from a powerful, noble family, one whose future seemed already written. He was expected to rise within the church, to gain influence, to carry forward the authority his family already possessed. But what made his life different was not his position, it was the kind of silence he carried, and the kind of questions that slowly began to form within it. From an early age, he was sent to the Abbey of Monte Cassino, a place that represented the height of religious discipline and intellectual tradition. The monastery stood not only as a symbol of faith, but as a center of control over knowledge itself. Life there followed strict routines: prayer, study, reflection, repetition. The goal was not to question the world, but to align oneself with it, to accept the divine order as it had been revealed. Yet within this environment, something unusual began to develop in him. He was not loud, not rebellious, not outwardly defiant. In fact, those around him often saw him as quiet to the point of being withdrawn. But that quietness hid something deeper. He was not simply accepting what he was being taught. He was observing it, turning it over, testing it in his own mind. At some point during these early years, he is said to have asked a question that would define everything that followed. Not, do I believe in God, but what is God? That question may sound simple, but in his time, it was radical. Because to ask what something is, rather than simply accept it, is to step into philosophy. As he grew older, the intellectual world around him began to shift. Europe was entering a period where ancient texts, long lost to the West, were being rediscovered. Among them were the works of Aristotle, a philosopher who approached the world not through faith, but through reason, observation, and logic. Aristotle's ideas did not depend on revelation. They depended on understanding how the world works. This created tension. For many religious authorities, Aristotle was dangerous. His ideas seemed to challenge the need for divine explanation. If the world could be understood through reason, then where does that leave faith? But for him, this was not a threat. It was an opening. He moved to Naples, one of the few places where these new ideas were being seriously studied. It was here that he encountered something that would change the direction of his life completely. The Dominican Order. Unlike the traditional religious paths tied to power and status, the Dominicans were different. They were thinkers. They believed that faith should not be protected from reason, but strengthened by it. They traveled, taught, debated, and most importantly, they questioned. Choosing to join them was not a small decision. It meant rejecting everything his family had planned for him. It meant stepping away from power, from wealth, from a guaranteed position in society. His family reacted strongly. They saw it as a loss of control, a rejection of legacy. At one point, they went so far as to detain him, keeping him isolated in an attempt to force him to abandon this path. But what is important here is not the event itself, but what it reveals. His commitment was not emotional or impulsive. It was intellectual. He had seen something in this path that he could not unsee. Once he fully entered the Dominican life, his thinking began to sharpen. He studied under Albertus Magnus, one of the most respected scholars of the time, who was already working to bring Aristotle's ideas into Christian thought. Under this influence, he did not simply learn philosophy. He learned how to think structurally, how to build arguments, how to move from observation to conclusion with precision. What began to take shape in his work was something entirely new. He refused to accept the idea that faith and reason were in conflict. Instead, he argued that both come from the same source, and therefore cannot truly contradict each other. If reason is used correctly, it should lead toward truth. And if faith is true, it should not fear reason. This position was not comfortable. It placed him between two worlds. On one side were those who believed philosophy was dangerous, that questioning could weaken faith. On the other side were those who believed reason alone was enough, that faith was unnecessary. He stood in between, attempting something far more difficult, not choosing one, but integrating both. This is where his most famous work begins to emerge. He started asking whether it is possible to demonstrate the existence of God using reason alone, not by quoting scripture, not by appealing to authority, but by observing the world and following logic step by step. He looked at motion. Everything that moves is moved by something else. But this chain cannot go back infinitely. There must be a starting point, something that initiates motion without itself being moved. He looked at causation. Every effect has a cause, but again, there must be a first cause that itself is uncaused. He looked at existence itself. Things exist, but they do not have to exist. So why is there something rather than nothing? These were not just religious arguments. They were philosophical ones, carefully structured, step by step, leading toward the conclusion that there must be something necessary, something that exists by its own nature, something that does not depend on anything else. But even here, he was careful. He did not claim that reason could fully understand God, only that it could point toward the necessity of something beyond the world. Beyond that, faith still had its place. What made his word powerful was not just the answers he gave, but the method he used. He showed that belief does not have to reject thinking, that faith does not have to exist in isolation from reason, and that the search for truth requires both. By this point in his life, he was no longer just a student or a quiet thinker. He was becoming something far more significant, a mind that would attempt to organize knowledge itself, to build a system where philosophy, theology, logic, and human experience all fit together. Not perfectly, but coherently. And this ambition, to bring order to everything, would define the rest of his work. As his intellectual path deepened, what began as a question about God slowly expanded into something much larger, a complete attempt to understand reality itself in a structured, disciplined, and almost architectural way. He was no longer just asking whether God exists. He was asking how everything that exists is connected, how truth is organized, and where human beings fit within that structure. His work began to take on a scale that very few thinkers had attempted before. During his years of teaching in Paris, one of the most intense intellectual environments of medieval Europe, he found himself at the center of a growing conflict. Universities were becoming places where ideas clashed openly. On one side were traditional theologians who believed that philosophy, especially the ideas of Aristotle, threatened the authority of faith. On the other side were thinkers who were beginning to push reason further, sometimes to the point where faith seemed unnecessary. He stood in the middle of this tension, but not passively. He was actively building a bridge between these two worlds, even as both sides questioned his position. What made his approach different was his discipline. He did not argue emotionally or rhetorically. He built arguments step by step, carefully laying out objections before responding to them. In his writing, he often began by presenting the strongest possible arguments against his own position. Only after fully acknowledging those objections would he begin constructing his response. This method gave his work a sense of intellectual honesty that made it difficult to dismiss. He was not avoiding criticism. He was confronting it directly. This approach reached its most complete form in his largest and most ambitious work, a project that attempted to organize nearly every major question about existence, knowledge, morality, and God into a single coherent system. It was not written as a narrative or story. It was structured almost like a map of thought, moving from basic questions to more complex ones, each answer leading to the next. But beneath this structure was something more than organization. There was a deep belief that truth itself is ordered, that reality is not chaotic but intelligible, and that the human mind, when used carefully, can understand at least part of that order. One of the central ideas he developed during this time was the relationship between essence and existence. In simple terms, he asked what something is and whether it exists. For most things in the world, these two are separate. A tree, for example, has a certain nature, but it does not have to exist. It could fail to grow, it could be destroyed, it could never have come into being at all. This means its existence is not necessary. It depends on something else. But if everything in the world depends on something else for its existence, then there must be something that does not depend on anything. Something whose essence is existence itself. Not something that happens to exist, but something that cannot not exist. This idea became central to his understanding of God. God, in this framework, is not just the first cause in a chain, but the only being whose existence is necessary, the foundation upon which everything else depends. This distinction may seem abstract, but it allowed him to build a system where everything in reality has a place. Nothing exists randomly. Everything that exists is part of a chain of dependence that ultimately leads back to something necessary. This gave his philosophy a sense of order and direction, something that was deeply appealing in a world that often felt unstable and uncertain. At the same time, he turned his attention to human life and ethics. If the world is ordered, then human behavior must also have a purpose within that order. He argued that human beings are not simply driven by impulse or desire. They are oriented toward a goal, something he described as the highest good. This highest good is not just pleasure or success. It is a state of fulfillment that comes from aligning one's life with truth and reason. He believed that human beings have the ability to recognize what is good through reason. This idea became the foundation of what is now called natural law. According to this view, moral principles are not arbitrary rules imposed from outside. They are grounded in human nature itself. By understanding what humans are, rational beings capable of understanding and choice, one can begin to understand how they ought to live. For example, because humans are social beings, living in community is part of their nature. Because they are rational, seeking truth is part of their purpose. Because they are capable of choice, they are responsible for their actions. From these observations, he argued that moral laws are not simply commands, but reflections of the structure of human existence. This idea had powerful implications. It meant that morality is not entirely dependent on religious authority. Even without revelation, human beings can discover basic moral truths through reason. At the same time, he did not reject the role of faith. He believed that reason can guide humans toward good, but faith can take them further, offering insights that go beyond what reason alone can reach. As his work expanded, so did his influence. Students gathered to hear him teach, not because he spoke dramatically, but because his clarity was rare. He could take complex questions and break them down into structured arguments that revealed their inner logic. Yet despite this clarity, his ideas were not always welcomed. Some authorities viewed his use of Aristotle with suspicion. Others feared that his emphasis on reason might weaken traditional beliefs. At one point, certain teachings influenced by Aristotle were formally condemned in Paris, creating an atmosphere where his work could easily have been rejected. But what protected his philosophy was its balance. He was not replacing faith with reason. He was strengthening it by showing that it could withstand rational examination. Through all of this, his ambition remained consistent. He was not trying to win debates or gain status. He was trying to build something lasting, a framework where truth, reason, and faith could exist together without contradiction. A system where the human mind is not forced to choose between thinking and believing, but is encouraged to do both with precision and discipline. By this stage of his life, he had moved far beyond the quiet student who once asked what God is. He had become a thinker attempting to answer not just that question, but almost every question that followed from it. And in doing so, he was shaping a vision of reality that would influence philosophy, theology, and ethics for centuries to come. As his work continued to expand, the system he was building began to move beyond abstract questions about existence and into the deeper structure of human life itself. It was no longer enough to explain what exists or why it exists. The more pressing question became how human beings should live within that reality. If the world is ordered, if everything has a cause and a purpose, then human life must also have a direction. And understanding that direction became one of his central concerns. He approached this question with the same discipline that defined all of his work. Rather than beginning with rules or commandments, he started with human nature. What is a human being? Not just physically, but intellectually and morally. He argued that humans are defined by their ability to reason. This ability is not simply a tool. It is what shapes their entire existence. It allows them to reflect, to choose, and to act with intention rather than impulse. From this starting point, he built a framework for understanding ethics that was both structured and deeply practical. If humans are rational beings, then the good life must involve the proper use of reason. But reason alone is not enough. It must guide action. This is where the concept of virtue becomes essential. Virtues are not abstract ideals. They are habits, ways of acting that develop over time through practice and discipline. He described virtues as the means through which human beings align themselves with their natural purpose. Courage, for example, is not simply the absence of fear. It is the ability to act rightly despite fear. Temperance is not the rejection of desire, but the ability to control it. Justice is not just a concept, but a consistent commitment to giving others what they are due. Each virtue represents a balance, a point between excess and deficiency, where human action becomes ordered and meaningful. What makes this framework powerful is that it does not rely on blind obedience. It requires understanding. A person must recognize what is good and choose it, not simply follow rules without thinking. This places responsibility on the individual. Human beings are not passive participants in the world. They are active agents capable of shaping their own lives. At the same time, he recognized that human understanding is limited. People make mistakes, they misunderstand, they act against their own best interests. This is where his integration of faith becomes important again. While reason can guide human beings toward the good, it does not guarantee perfection. Faith provides a further dimension, offering guidance that goes beyond what reason alone can achieve. He also explored the idea of law in a way that reflected this balance between reason and authority. Law, in his view, is not simply a set of rules imposed by those in power. It is an expression of order. A true law reflects the structure of reality and the nature of human beings. It guides behavior not by force alone, but by aligning with what is good. He described different levels of law, beginning with what he called eternal law, the underlying order of the universe, known fully only to God. From this emerges natural law, which human beings can understand through reason. And for natural law comes human law, the specific rules created by societies to organize behavior. This hierarchy allowed him to explain how human laws should be grounded in something deeper than political authority. If a law contradicts reason and the natural good, it loses its legitimacy. This idea introduced a subtle but powerful limitation on authority. Rulers do not have absolute power. Their authority depends on their alignment with a higher order. This was a significant claim in a time when political power was often justified as unquestionable. By grounding law in reason and nature, he created a framework where power itself could be evaluated. As his thinking matured, he also turned toward questions about knowledge and truth. How do human beings come to know anything at all? He rejected the idea that knowledge is purely innate or purely given. Instead, he argued that it begins with experience. Humans encounter the world through their senses, and from these experiences, the mind abstracts general principles. Knowledge, therefore, is built gradually, moving from observation to understanding. This process reflects again his commitment to balance. He did not reject sensory experience in favor of pure reason. nor did he reduce knowledge to simple observation. Both are necessary. Experience provides the material, and reason organizes it into coherent understanding. Throughout this period, his writing continued growing in scale and complexity. He addressed questions about the soul, the nature of happiness, the role of grace, and the relationship between human freedom and divine will. Each topic was approached with the same methodical structure: objections, responses, clarifications, building layer upon layer of argument. Yet despite the complexity, there was a consistent thread running through everything he wrote. The belief that truth is not fragmented, that reality, despite its complexity, can be understood as a coherent whole, and that human beings, through the combined use of reason and faith, can find their place within that whole. By this stage, he had become one of the most influential thinkers of his time. His lectures attracted students from across Europe. His writings circulated widely, shaping debates within universities and religious institutions. But influence did not mean acceptance without resistance. Some still viewed his ideas with suspicion, especially his reliance on Aristotle. Others questioned whether his attempt to unify reason and faith could truly succeed. Yet what made his work endure was not that it resolved every question, but that it approached them with clarity and discipline. He did not avoid complexity. He engaged with it directly, building a system that attempted to account for both the visible world and the invisible principles behind it. And as his life moved forward, this system would face its final test, not an argument or debate, but in a moment that would challenge the very value of everything he had written. As his life moved toward its final years, something unexpected began to happen. After decades of building one of the most structured and comprehensive systems of thought in medieval history, after writing thousands of pages analyzing existence, morality, law, and the nature of God, his relationship with his own work began to change. The man who had spent his entire life trying to explain truth with precision and discipline started to encounter the limits of that effort in a way that no argument could fully capture. Up to this point, everything about his philosophy had been driven by clarity. Define the question, examine objections, respond with logic, build a coherent structure. It was a method that brought order to complexity, a way of showing that truth could be approached step by step. But in the final phase of his life, there are accounts that suggest he experienced something that did not fit into this structure, something that could not be reduced to argument or explained through reasoning. After what is described as a profound spiritual experience, he is said to have made a statement that has echoed through history. Everything he had written, everything he had built, he described as straw compared to what had been revealed to him. This does not mean his work was meaningless. It means that he had reached a point where the limits of language, logic, and human understanding became undeniable. This moment is important, not because it rejects his philosophy, but because it completes it. Throughout his life, he had argued that reason can take us far, but not all the way. That faith and direct experience of the divine go beyond what the human mind can fully grasp. In the end, his own life reflected that principle. The system he built was not wrong, but it was incomplete because reality itself extends beyond what can be fully captured in concepts. After this moment, he largely stopped writing. The massive project that had defined his intellectual life was left unfinished. For someone so disciplined, so committed to structure and completion, this is striking. It suggests a shift, not away from truth, but toward a different understanding of how truth is encountered. Yet, even without completion, his work had already reshaped the intellectual world. His ideas continued to spread through universities, influencing generations of scholars. What made his system so enduring was its balance. He had not chosen between faith and reason, but had shown how both could exist together without contradiction. This allowed his philosophy to survive in environments where either extreme would have failed. Over time, his influence grew beyond his own era. His ideas became central to the development of theology, shaping how religious thinkers approach questions about God, morality, and human nature. At the same time, His use of reason and logic influenced the broader development of philosophy, contributing to the way later thinkers approach questions of knowledge and existence. His concept of natural law, in particular, had lasting impact. The idea that moral principles can be discovered through reason, grounded in human nature rather than imposed arbitrarily, continued to shape discussions about ethics and law long after his death. It provided a framework where morality is not just a matter of belief, but something that can be understood, debated, and applied in real life. He died in 1274 at the age of 49, relatively young considering the scale of what he had accomplished. His death came while he was traveling, still engaged in the intellectual and religious life that had defined him. There was no dramatic conclusion, no final statement that resolved everything he had worked on. Instead, his legacy was left in the structure of his work itself, a system that others would continue to study, interpret, and debate. What makes his story powerful is not just the scale of his ideas, but the tension within them. He believed deeply in the power of reason, yet acknowledged its limits. He built one of the most complete systems of thought in history, yet in the end recognized that no system can fully contain reality. This tension is not a weakness. It is what gives his philosophy its depth. His life leaves behind a question that still matters. How far can human understanding go? And what happens when it reaches its limit? For him, the answer was not to abandon thinking, but to recognize that thinking itself is part of something larger. That truth is not only something to be explained, but something to be experienced. The intellectual journey that began with a quiet question in a monastery, "What is God?" did not end with a final answer. It ended with a deeper realization that the search for truth is not only about building arguments, but about encountering something that cannot be fully reduced to them. And that realization continues to shape how his work is understood even today. Not as a closed system with final answers, but as a bridge, one that stretches between reason and faith, between understanding and mystery, inviting those who study it to walk that same path, knowing that it does not end with certainty, but with a deeper awareness of how much remains beyond it. Thomas Aquinas begins his philosophy with a very specific goal that sets him apart from many thinkers before and after him. He is not trying to replace religion with reason, and he is not trying to ignore reason in favor of faith. Instead, he attempts to bring both together into one complete system. His question is simple but extremely deep. If the world can be understood through logic and observation, then how does that connect to the idea of God, creation, and human purpose? To build this system, he relies heavily on the work of Aristotle. Aristotle had already created a powerful method of understanding reality by focusing on observation, cause and effect, and logical reasoning. Aquinas takes these tools and applies them to questions that go beyond the physical world. He believes that by carefully examining how things exist and change, it is possible to reach conclusions about deeper truths. He begins by observing something very basic but important. Everything in the world is in motion or undergoing change. This does not only mean physical movement like a ball rolling or a person walking. It includes all kinds of change. A child growing into an adult, a seed turning into a tree, water heating into steam, or even a person learning something new. Everywhere we look, things are constantly moving from one state to another. This observation may seem simple, but Aquinas sees something deeper in it. When something changes, it does not change randomly or by itself. There is always a cause behind that change. A seed does not grow into a tree without soil, water, and sunlight. A person does not suddenly gain knowledge without learning. Every change depends on something that brings it about. This leads to a chain of causes. One thing causes another, which causes something else. At first, this seems straightforward, but Aquinas pushes the idea further. If every change is caused by something else, then that cause must also have a cause. This creates a sequence that goes backward. Now, the important question appears. Can this chain of causes go back infinitely, or must it have a starting point? Aquinas argues that it cannot go back forever. If there were no first cause, then there would be no reason for anything to exist now. Because if everything depends on something before it, but there is no beginning, then nothing would ever actually start. From this reasoning, he concludes that there must be a first cause. This first cause is not like ordinary things in the world. It is not something that changes or depends on anything else. Instead, it exists on its own and is responsible for the existence of everything else. This idea becomes one of his central arguments for the existence of God. He develops this idea further by looking at existence itself. When we look at the world, we notice that things exist, but they do not have to exist. A person exists, but there was a time before they were born. A tree exists, but it can be cut down or fail to grow. Everything we see is capable of existing, but also capable of not existing. This means that most things are what he calls contingent. Their existence depends on certain conditions. They are not necessary. They can come into existence and also pass out of it. But this raises a serious problem. If everything were contingent, then it would be possible for nothing to exist at all. There could have been a moment where nothing existed. And if that were true, then nothing could exist now, because nothing cannot create something. To avoid this contradiction, Aquinas argues that there must be something that exists necessarily, something that does not depend on anything else and cannot fail to exist. This necessary being becomes another way of describing the foundation of reality. At this point, his argument becomes stronger. He is not just saying that there's a first cause. He is saying that there is something whose existence is not dependent, something that exists by its own nature. This being does not begin or end. It is not part of the chain of dependent things. It is the reason the chain exists at all. He continues by examining how we compare things in the world. People often describe things in terms of more or less. One thing is better than another. One idea is more true than another. One action is more good than another. These comparisons suggest that there is some standard being used, even if it is not always clearly defined. For example, when we say something is more good, we are comparing it to a higher idea of goodness. This implies that there is a highest level of goodness that serves as a reference point. The same applies to truth, beauty, and other qualities. From this, Aquinas argues that there must be something that represents these qualities in their fullest form. Not just partially good or partially true, but completely and perfectly so. This highest level becomes another way of understanding the foundation of reality. He also looks at the natural world and notices that it follows consistent patterns. Even things that do not have intelligence, like plants or natural elements, behave in predictable ways. They move towards certain outcomes. For example, plants grow toward light, and natural systems maintain balance in ways that are not random. This suggests that there is some form of order in the world. Things are not acting randomly. They are directed toward certain results. But if something does not have intelligence, it cannot direct itself toward a goal on its own. From this, Aquinas argues that there must be some underlying principle or intelligence that explains this order. Not necessarily in a visible or direct way, but as a deeper structure that allows consistent patterns to exist. All of these ideas come together into what are known as his 5 ways. They are not separate arguments with different conclusions. They are different approaches that all point to the same idea. By examining motion, cause, existence, degrees of perfection, and order, he built a logical path toward a single foundation of reality. For Aquinas, this foundation is what people call God. But his approach is important. He is not starting with belief and trying to defend it. He is starting with observation and reasoning, and showing that these lead toward the idea of a necessary, uncaused, and ordered source of existence. However, this is only the beginning of his philosophy. Proving that such a being exists is not the final goal. The more important question is what this means for human life. If reality has a structure, if existence has a source, then human beings are part of that structure. Their actions are not random. Their understanding of right and wrong is not arbitrary. Their purpose is not meaningless. This leads Aquinas to move from questions about existence to questions about knowledge. How do humans come to know truth? Can they rely on their senses, or do they need something more? How does reason work, and what are its limits? He also begins to explore morality. If there is an order in the universe, then human behavior must fit into that order in some way. Actions are not simply good or bad based on opinion. There must be a deeper standard that defines what is right. At the same time, he looks at the purpose of human life. If everything in nature has a direction or goal, then human life must also have a purpose. Understanding this purpose becomes essential to understanding how a person should live. Through all of this, his philosophy begins to expand from the structure of the universe to the structure of human existence. What started as an investigation into motion and cause becomes a complete system that connects reality, knowledge, morality, and purpose into one unified understanding. And as this system develops further, the focus begins to shift from proving that a foundation exists to understanding how human beings can know truth, live correctly, and move toward their ultimate purpose within that structure. Now, as Aquinas moves forward, his focus shifts from the structure of reality itself to a deeper and more practical question. If there is a foundation to existence, if there is order in the universe, then how do human beings come to understand that order? In other words, how do we know anything at all? And how reliable is that knowledge? He begins by rejecting the idea that knowledge comes purely from abstract thinking alone. Instead, he argues that all human knowledge starts with experience. A person is not born with fully formed ideas about the world. They begin with the senses. They see, hear, touch, and interact with their surroundings. And from these experiences, knowledge begins to form. This idea is heavily influenced by Aristotle, but Aquinas develops it further. When a person sees an object, they do not immediately understand its deeper nature. At first, they only perceive its appearance. Over time, the mind begins to process these sensory experiences and extract patterns, meanings, and general ideas. For example, a person may see many different trees. Each tree looks slightly different, but the mind begins to recognize what they have in common. From this, the concept of a tree is formed. This process of moving from individual experiences to general understanding becomes the foundation of human knowledge. Aquinas explains this using the idea that the mind has the ability to abstract. It takes specific details from experience and forms universal ideas. These universal ideas allow humans to think beyond individual cases and understand broader truths. However, he also recognizes that the senses alone are not enough. While they provide the raw material for knowledge, the mind must actively process and organize that information. Without the mind's ability to reason, sensory experiences would remain disconnected and unclear. This leads to an important balance in his philosophy. Knowledge requires both experience and reason. Experience provides the data, and reason organizes and understands it. Neither can function properly without the other. At the same time, Aquinas acknowledges that human knowledge has limits. Because it begins with the senses, it is always connected to the physical world. This means that certain truths, especially those related to the nature of God, cannot be fully understood through reason alone. This is where he introduces the relationship between reason and faith. For Aquinas, these two are not in conflict. Instead, they work together. Reason can lead a person to certain truths about existence, such as the idea that there must be a first cause or a necessary being. But there are deeper truths that go beyond what human reason can fully grasp. Faith, in this context, is not blind belief. It is a way of accepting truths that cannot be proven completely through reasoning, but are not irrational either. These truths do not contradict reason, but they go beyond its limits. For example, reason may suggest that there is a foundation of reality, but it may not fully explain the nature of that foundation. Faith allows a person to move further, accepting ideas that reason alone cannot fully reach. This creates a system where knowledge is divided into different levels. Some truths can be discovered through observation and reasoning. Others require faith, but both are part of a single structure of understanding. From here, Aquinas moves into a deeper exploration of truth itself. What does it mean for something to be true? He defines truth as the agreement between the mind and reality. when the mind correctly understands something as it actually is, that is truth. This may seem simple, but it has important consequences. It means that truth is not something created by individuals. It is not based on opinion or preference. Instead, it exists independently, and the role of the mind is to recognize it. This view of truth leads to a strong emphasis on objective reality. The world exists in a certain way, and human beings must align their understanding with that reality. Mistakes happen when the mind fails to accurately reflect what is actually there. At the same time, this raises another question. If truth exists independently, then where does it ultimately come from? Aquinas connects truth to the foundation of reality itself. If everything depends on a necessary being, then truth must also be grounded in that same source. In this way, truth is not just a feature of human thought. It is part of the structure of existence. Understanding truth becomes a way of aligning the human mind with the deeper reality that underlies everything. This idea begins to connect knowledge with purpose. If humans are capable of knowing truth, then this ability must have a role within the larger structure of existence. Knowledge is not random. It serves a purpose in helping individuals understand their place in the world. From here, Aquinas moves toward the question of human nature. What kind of beings are humans, and what makes them different from other forms of life? He argues that humans are unique because they possess both a physical body and a rational mind. The body connects humans to the physical world, while the mind allows them to think, reason, and understand. This combination creates a being that is capable of both experiencing the world and reflecting on it. Because of this, human life is not limited to basic survival. Humans are capable of seeking truth, making decisions, and directing their actions towards certain goals. This introduces the idea that human beings have a purpose that goes beyond simple existence. Aquinas begins to explore this purpose by looking at how humans act. Every action is directed towards some kind of goal. People do things because they're trying to achieve something, whether it's pleasure, success, knowledge, or something else. This leads to the idea that there must be a highest goal, something that all other goals ultimately point toward. If there were no final goal, then human actions would have no clear direction. They would be scattered and meaningless. He argues that this highest goal is not something temporary or limited. It must be something complete and fulfilling, something that satisfies the deepest desires of human nature. This idea begins to move his philosophy toward ethics and the question of how a person should live. At this stage, the structure becomes clearer. Reality has a foundation. Humans can know that reality through a combination of experience and reason. Truth exists independently and can be understood by the mind. And human beings are directed toward a purpose that gives meaning to their actions. All of these ideas begin to connect, forming a system where knowledge, existence, and purpose are not separate topics, but parts of a single framework. As this framework continues to develop, the next step is to examine morality in detail. If humans have a purpose, then their actions must be evaluated based on whether they move toward or away from that purpose. This leads Aquinas into one of the most important parts of his philosophy, where he explains how humans determine right and wrong, how laws are formed, and how moral life fits into the larger structure of reality itself. As Aquinas moves further, his philosophy becomes more focused on one of the most important questions in human life. If there is an order to reality, and if human beings have a purpose, then how should a person actually live? What makes an action right or wrong? And how can someone know the difference in a consistent and reliable way? He begins by building on something he has already established. Every action that a person takes is directed towards some goal. People do not act randomly. Even simple actions are done for a reason, whether it is to gain something good or to avoid something harmful. Eating is done to remove hunger. Studying is done to gain knowledge. And working is done to achieve stability or success. But not all goals are equal. Some are temporary, while others are more important and lasting. Aquinas argues that there must be a highest goal that gives direction to all other actions. This highest goal is what ultimately defines whether a life is being lived well or not. He identifies this highest goal as happiness, but he does not mean happiness in the simple sense of pleasure or comfort. He means something deeper and more complete. True happiness, in his view, is the full realization of human potential. It is a state where a person is living in alignment with their nature and purpose. Temporary pleasures cannot satisfy this completely. A person may gain comfort, wealth, or success, but these do not last, and they do not fulfill the deeper need for meaning. Because of this, Aquinas argues that true happiness must be something stable and complete, not something that can be easily lost. This leads him to connect happiness with truth and understanding. Since humans are rational beings, their fulfillment must involve the use of reason. To live well is not just to feel good, but to understand reality correctly and act in accordance with that understanding. From here, he develops his theory of morality. Actions are not judged simply by their outcomes or by personal preference. They are judged based on whether they align with human nature and the ultimate purpose of life. An action is good if it moves a person toward their true fulfillment, and bad if it moves them away from it. To explain this more clearly, Aquinas introduces the idea of natural law. This is one of the central parts of his philosophy. Natural law is not a written set of rules created by society. It is a deeper principle built into human nature itself. According to this idea, humans have certain natural tendencies. They seek to survive, to reproduce, to live in society, and to seek truth. These tendencies are not random. They are part of what it means to be human. Because of this, actions that support these tendencies are considered good, while actions that go against them are considered wrong. For example, preserving life is considered good because it aligns with the natural tendency to survive. Seeking truth is good because humans are rational beings. Living in a stable society is good because humans depend on cooperation with others. This means that morality is not arbitrary. It is not simply based on personal opinion or cultural preference. It is grounded in the nature of human beings. By understanding human nature, it becomes possible to understand what is right and wrong. At the same time, Aquinas recognizes that applying these principles is not always simple. Real-life situations can be complex, and people can make mistakes in judgment. Because of this, he emphasizes the role of reason in moral decision-making. Reason allows individuals to examine situations, consider consequences, and choose actions that align with their true purpose. Without reason, people may act based on impulse or emotion, which can lead them away from what is truly good. This brings him to the concept of virtue. Virtues are habits or qualities that help a person act in the right way consistently. They are not one-time actions, but stable patterns of behavior that develop over time. For example, courage is not just a single act of bravery. It is the habit of facing difficulty in the right way. Temperance is the habit of controlling desires and avoiding excess. Justice is the habit of treating others fairly. These virtues help guide human behavior. Instead of relying on constant decision-making in every situation, a person with strong virtues naturally tends to act in the right way. Their character becomes aligned with their purpose. Aquinas divides virtues into different types. Some are natural and can be developed through practice and experience. Others are higher and relate to a person's relationship with the ultimate foundation of reality. These higher virtues go beyond what human effort alone can achieve. At this point, his philosophy begins to connect morality with something even larger. If the ultimate goal of human life is complete fulfillment, and if that fulfillment is connected to the foundation of reality, then moral life is not just about following rules. It is about moving toward that ultimate goal. This gives morality a deeper meaning. It is not just about avoiding wrong actions or following social expectations. It is about shaping one's life in a way that leads to true fulfillment. He also examines the role of laws in society. While natural law exists as a universal principle, human societies create their own laws to maintain order. These laws are necessary because not everyone will always act according to reason. However, for a law to be truly just, it must align with natural law. If a law goes against human nature or promotes harmful behavior, then it is not a true law in the fullest sense. It may still be enforced, but it lacks moral legitimacy. This idea places a limit on authority. Governments have power, but that power must be used in a way that supports the natural order of human life. Laws are meant to guide people toward good behavior, not simply control them. Another important aspect of his moral philosophy is intention. It is not enough to look only at the outcome of an action. The intention behind the action also matters. A person who does something good for the wrong reasons is not acting in the same way as someone who does it with the right intention. This adds another layer to moral evaluation. Actions must be understood in terms of what is done, why it is done, and how it is done. All of these factors together determine whether an action is truly good. As this system develops, it becomes clear that Aquinas is building a complete framework for understanding human life. It begins with the structure of reality, moves through knowledge and truth, and arrives at a detailed explanation of morality and purpose. Everything is connected. The way the world exists, the way humans understand it, and the way they act within it are all part of a single system. And as this system reaches its final stage, the focus turns toward the ultimate question that lies at the center of everything he has built. If human life has a purpose, and if that purpose is connected to the foundation of reality, then what is the final goal that all of this is leading toward? And what does it mean to fully achieve it? As Aquinas brings his philosophy to its final stage, everything he has built begins to point toward one central conclusion. If reality has a foundation, if truth can be known, and if human actions can be judged as right or wrong, then all of this must lead somewhere. It cannot simply exist without a final direction. There must be an ultimate goal that gives meaning to everything else. He returns to the idea introduced earlier, that every action is directed toward some good. People act because they're seeking something they believe will fulfill them. But most of the things people pursue do not fully satisfy them. Wealth can be lost. Pleasure fades. Power is unstable. Even knowledge, while important, does not completely fulfill the human desire for meaning. This leads to an important realization. If none of these temporary things can fully satisfy human desire, then the ultimate goal must be something beyond them. It must be something complete, something that cannot be lost, and something that fully satisfies the deepest part of human nature. Aquinas identifies this final goal as perfect happiness, but again, not in the ordinary sense. This is not about comfort or success. It is about complete fulfillment, a state where nothing is lacking. It is the full realization of human potential in its highest form. Because humans are rational beings, this fulfillment must involve understanding. But not just understanding small parts of the world. It must involve understanding the highest truth, the foundation of reality itself. In other words, true fulfillment comes from knowing and being connected to the ultimate source of existence. At this point, his philosophy reaches its most important conclusion. The final goal of human life is not found in anything within the changing world. It is found in direct knowledge of the ultimate reality that underlies everything. This idea is often described as the highest form of knowledge or the ultimate vision of truth. It is a state where the mind is no longer searching or questioning because it has reached complete understanding. All the movement, all the effort, and all the seeking come to rest in this final realization. This does not mean that human life in the world is meaningless. On the contrary, everything in life becomes part of the journey toward this goal. Every action, every decision, and every effort to understand truth contributes to moving closer to that final state. This gives a new meaning to morality. Moral actions are not just about following rules or avoiding punishment. They are about aligning oneself with the ultimate purpose of life. When a person acts in the right way, they are not just doing something good in a small sense. They are moving closer to their final fulfillment. Virtues, which were discussed earlier, now take on their full importance. They are not just useful habits. They are the means by which a person shapes their life towards ultimate goal. By developing virtues, a person becomes more aligned with truth, more capable of making correct decisions, and more prepared to reach complete fulfillment. At the same time, Aquinas recognizes that human effort alone has limits. While reason can guide a person and help them understand much about the world, it cannot fully reach the ultimate truth by itself. There is a gap between human understanding and the highest reality. This is where his philosophy once again brings in the role of faith. Faith is not a replacement for reason, but a completion of it. It allows a person to move beyond the limits of human understanding and accept truths that cannot be fully proven through reasoning alone. In this way, reason and faith work together. Reason builds the foundation, allowing a person to understand the structure of reality and the principles of morality. Faith allows a person to go further, reaching toward the final goal that reason alone cannot fully grasp. This creates a complete system where nothing is left disconnected. Reality has a structure. Knowledge allows humans to understand that structure. Morality guides their actions within it. And the final goal gives meaning to everything along the way. Another important conclusion emerges from this system. Human life is not random or meaningless. It has a direction and a purpose. Every person is part of a larger structure that extends beyond individual existence. This also means that human dignity has a deeper foundation. People are not valuable simply because of social roles or achievements. They have value because they are capable of knowing truth and moving toward the highest form of fulfillment. At the same time, this philosophy creates a sense of order in how life should be lived. Actions are not judged based on changing opinions or temporary desires. They are judged based on whether they align with the deeper structure of reality and the ultimate goal of human existence. This gives stability to moral thinking. Even when societies change, the underlying principles remain the same because they are based on human nature and the structure of reality itself. As everything comes together, Aquinas presents a vision of life that is both structured and meaningful. The world is not chaotic or without purpose. It is ordered, understandable, and directed toward a final goal. Human beings are not lost within this system. They have the ability to understand it, to act within it, and to move toward its highest fulfillment. Their choices matter, their actions have direction, and their lives are part of something larger than themselves. In the end, his philosophy does not leave the listener with uncertainty or endless questioning. Instead, it offers a complete framework. It begins with simple observations about change and existence, builds through knowledge and morality, and ends with a clear idea of purpose and fulfillment. Everything points toward a single conclusion. Life is not just something that happens. It is something that moves step by step toward a final state of complete understanding and fulfillment, where the search for truth comes to rest and where the meaning of existence is fully realized.